Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Arik Burkovsky, and I am the Assistant Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program here at Fletcher, and it is my honor to introduce today's distinguished guest speaker. Dr. Serhii Plokhy is the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. He is a leading authority on Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe. He focuses on international history of World War II and the Cold War, and he's an award-winning and best-selling author, and is here today to present his latest book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. And this promises to be, I think, a fascinating conversation on Russian and Ukrainian history in the lead up to the devastating, tragic war that we have today. It recently marked its 19th month. The event will proceed as follows. Dr. Plokhy will first give a brief introduction to the book. Then my colleague, Professor Daniel Drezner, will have a short conversation with him, and then we will open it up to all of you for questions. So we should have a lively conversation. Let me briefly introduce Professor Drezner. He is a professor of international politics, a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the co-director of Fletcher's Russia and Eurasia Program. So without further ado, Dr. Plokhy.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this introduction. I wonder it's on. Maybe it's a little bit better. Okay, good. So it's a pleasure to be here, and we were talking before the meeting started. This is my second talk, I guess, at Tufts, and the first one was before the pandemic. Maybe one of the last events before the pandemic, and certainly I could imagine coming back to Tufts. I couldn't imagine what the reason would be, and the reason is, of course, not the book per se, but about the reason is the subject of the book, the all-out Russo-Ukrainian War. The war that really now it's quite clear already for at least a year, probably more than a year, that this is the largest industrial military conflict in Europe since World War II. It's also the largest in terms of of course, armies involved, the destruction that is happening as the result of the war, the number of refugees, number of suffering. So there is nothing in Europe since 1945 to compare it to, but to World War II. So it is quite significant, not only in terms of Ukraine, not only in terms of Russia, but also in terms of Europe and in terms of global changes and global developments. So this is the real reason, the real topic of this discussion, of this conversation. When it comes to the book itself, I certainly didn't imagine writing it, as I didn't imagine the war of that sort of scale and that sort of proportion. And when I was approached by my publisher whether I would want to write a book on the war, and that was very early on, it was March, I said definitely no. And I said definitely no for two reasons. The first one was just emotional. You can't comprehend what is going on. It's the only way how I could describe what was going on is criminality, and that's probably not enough for the book unless you're a legal scholar or a lawyer. Another reason why I said no was that as a historian, we are trained to really deal with the issues of change and continuity. This is a very broad, the most broad probably definition of what history is about. but also we are dealing with the description, analysis, conceptualization of the processes that are already over, right? So we are sort of Monday quarterbacks. Our wisdom comes from the fact that we know already the result of the game. We know what happened there. It's not, again, not to diminish in any way the importance of the profession. It is extremely important to analyze what is happening as you prepare to the next game, the next weekend. So even from that pragmatic point of view, and of course, history as to a degree that it is part of humanities has other purposes and other values as well. So, but the war was just starting, and that's why the answer was also no. But it changed over time, and it changed for a number of reasons. One reason was that that war is rhetorically and otherwise is so much rooted into history, like any other, unlike any other war that I read about, that I wrote about, that I'm aware about. I really can't bring an example of another war that starts with the historical or pseudo-historical essay being published a few months before the start of the all-out war. And I refer, of course, to Vladimir Putin's On Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. By the way, either in today's or in yesterday's New York Times, there is a wonderful piece by Mikhail Zygar. It seems to me welcome Putin's ghostwriter on Medinsky and basically the way how that essay was created and how Putin's historical pronouncements are made in that regard. So I certainly recommend you to look at that. So there was that essay, and there was a narrative that was presented that was justifying from the historical point of view, from the point of view of the formation of national identities, what I certainly considered to be a crime and still consider to be a crime. So there was something that was basically asking for response, asking for a historical perspective. So that was one reason. Another reason was that the media and those of us who are in Ukrainian studies, in Russian studies, know what was happening around that time. We were bombarded really with emails, with invitations about the commentary. And to my surprise, people actually kept coming back to me. And I thought, okay, maybe there is something in historical perspective that is important, that is explaining what is happening. And there was a lot of history in that beyond Putin's misrepresentation of history, in terms of even looking at the developments since 1991, looking at the fact that the war didn't really start on February 24th, 2022, but started in late February of 2014. So at the end, I convinced myself, and I write about that in the book, that I rephrased Winston Churchill, who said that democracy was the worst form of government except every other. So I turned it into historians are the worst commentators on contemporary developments except everybody else. So no offense to my colleagues in different disciplines. So that what gave me some confidence in doing what I was doing, and also I couldn't just stay still. I had somehow professionally respond to what is going on. The outcome is this book. Originally it was planned to be 6 chapters, then there were 8. Then there were 13. So it's basically a very, very difficult task to write history at the time when it is happening. It is extremely challenging. And the easiest part is just adding chapters. The most difficult part is also to figuring out the events that are happening today, whether they are the sort of events that we'll remember tomorrow, whether they are the sort of events that matter 1 year from now, whether this is something tells us about the war, whether this is a sort of a turning point in some way, on some level, that would explain, would help us to understand the war and explain the war. And it is very, very difficult task, especially for someone trained as a historian. So I will talk about the book in very general terms. And I will talk about four major maybe themes in the book. And one of them is chronology, another is geography and geopolitics, the third is ideas, and then the fourth is the war impact. So these are the themes that I will try to cover. And I'll start with chronology, which the theme that I already alluded to when I said that we all talk about this war as something that started in February of 2022, when in reality, the beginning was in March of 2014 with the Russian special forces units taking over the buildings of the Crimean parliament and Crimean cabinet of ministers. And the war after that takeover within a few short weeks really started in eastern Ukraine in Donbass. It was sort of dismissed as a hybrid war and hybrid warfare. A lot of made out of Mr. Gerasimov and his military genius. From students who worked with me and wrote papers on Gerasimov doctrine, the impression that I got that Gerasimov was not inventing anything particularly new. He was trying to catch up with what was happening already in US and in other parts of the world. But the hybrid war, among many other things, apart from the actually raising on the pedestal, not just Gerasimov, but Russian army, was also a way to consider this war as not a real war, but something else, something that doesn't really require a sort of response that a real war, not a hybrid war, would require, strongly require. But speaking about the chronology of this war, I start, if not the war itself, then certainly preconditions for that war much earlier. And there are two key points for understanding of this war, at least the way how I frame it. One key point is 1914, not even 2014, so 100 years to the date, almost not to the date, but to the year before the annexation of the Crimea. And another important point is 1991. What are these points about? The start of World War I, this is actually the start of the process of unraveling traditional European empires, which disappear from the map, from Austria-Hungary to the Ottoman Empire, and something that we actually tend to really overlook is that the Russian Empire actually also disintegrated. The Russian Empire disintegrated to the same degree as Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Empire disintegrated in the course of World War I and immediately after World War I. The trick was that the Bolsheviks came up with some innovative techniques to bring the empire back. One which was not very innovative was the army, but it was also a different type of an army with different type of ideology. But ideology was really new, not only in terms of the class approach, but also in terms of the framing revolution eventually also as a national revolution, and making concessions to the nationalities in terms of the language, in terms of culture, and among other things, recognizing that unlike the politicians and ideologues of the Russian Empire wrote, thought, and believed in, Ukraine was not one of many tribes of the big Russian nation. Ukraine was a separate nation. The Bolsheviks admitted that again, and that one of the indications of the way how flexible they were, how innovative they were, and how they were able to bring re-establish control over the realm of the Tsars and actually extend the borders of the Russian Empire. Now, a lot of people believed, including Mikhail Gorbachev, that that was the solution to the national question, that the national question was solved. But then comes along 1991, and The Soviet Union, the debate whether it was an empire, what was imperial, what was not imperial about it is still going on. The Soviet Union dies the death of an empire, falling apart along the borders associated with the units, political units defined in ethnic and ethno-national terms. So a classic death of an empire with mobilization of the national movements in the republic being one of the factors. Again, there is a debate how important the factor was, one of the factors in the death of the Soviet Union. And there was a sigh of relief everywhere. The Soviet Union fell apart without global war. Stephen Kotkin writes, eventually Armageddon averted, and that was a real concern. The war between major republics didn't take place, didn't happen. And it looked like that the history really didn't matter anymore. Subtitle of my book again goes to Francis Fukuyama article, and then the title of his book about the end of history. The feeling of the end of history was far going beyond of what Fukuyama was writing about, writing about the ultimate victory of the liberal democracy. The understanding of what end of history meant was also the end of the annexations of the territory, the end of the big, large-scale wars, the sort of the wars that very much defined the 20th century. There was that feeling there as well. And that the Russia can be turned overnight, and other republics as well, into democracies, well-functioning democracies, because as Solzhenitsyn was saying, of course, it's all about the evil communism that was imposed on Russia. You remove communism and you get all that prosperity. So what we now know is that didn't happen. What we now know that the history in its most ugly manifestations of the 20th century is back. I started with saying that there is a parallel between the current war and World War II, and there is nothing in between that you can compare this war to. And in that sense, at least in my reading, this war is a classic war of disintegration of empire. The sort of things that we saw in the basically the process that maybe arguably starts with the American Revolution. And most of these processes of disintegration of empires really are accompanied by bloodshed and accompanied by wars. Somehow we believe that we kind of skipped that turn. We make the turn that actually not going the way of other imperial collapses. And what is very clear today in 2023 is that actually that didn't happen. This is the war of the imperial disintegration, and it is a in many ways classic war of independence or postponed war of independence on part of Ukraine. So that's about chronology. Let me shift to geography and talk about geopolitics, despite the fact that talking about empires, you can't talk only about time, you also talk about space. So geopolitics is something that, again, in my opinion, very important to understand the origins of the current war. I said, and I repeat it again, the war started in February of 2014. The question is why? What happened in February of 2014 to start the war?
The Maidan Revolution and Viktor Yanukovych.
Oh, okay, bingo. What the revolution was about?
It's corruption.
Corruption was one of the themes.
It's the refusal to join the EU cornerstone.
Bingo. So signing association agreement with European Union, not joining NATO, not joining European Union, signing, excuse my language, a lousy association agreement with European Union. works as a trigger for the war, works as a trigger for annexation of the Crimea, and then basically the quote unquote hybrid war in Donbass. Why is that? I will not ask audience anymore for help. I will answer that question myself. So if Ukraine or any other country signs association agreement with European Union, it becomes not eligible to join any other similar organization or institution, which means Ukraine would not be able to join Eurasian Union. That's the project, Vladimir Putin's project of rebuilding, reestablishing Russian control over the post-Soviet space. What is there in the concept, behind the concept of Eurasian Union, is thinking that already is very clear in Moscow in the 1990s. And then it's very clearly presented by Vladimir Putin in his Munich speech in 2007. And what Putin is saying there, following in the footsteps of some of earlier Russian foreign policy experts, is that the unipolar world, the US-centered world, is something that doesn't work for Russia in particular, and doesn't work for the world in general. And the alternative model to that is a multipolar world. And for Russia to emerge as a center of multipolar world between China and European Union, one thing becomes extremely important, and this thing is actually reestablishing control over the resources of the post-Soviet space. So the war really starts, or at least the trigger for the war in 2014 is not NATO expansion. I'm not questioning that Mr. Putin was not happy about NATO expansion, but it is not about NATO expansion. It is about signing association agreement with European Union, and one of the potential key members of the Eurasian Union trying to escape. So, and holding that escapee by occupying Crimea and then by starting never-ending war in eastern Ukraine. That's where at least the way how I look at that, the main geopolitical reason for the war and then continuation of the war in 2022 lies. Because what happened after 2014 and signing of 2 Minsk agreements, in Moscow, they finally understand and realize that drift of Ukraine toward the West continues. In the article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin, actually, there is a very interesting paragraph where he says, roughly, I rephrase, the evil West introduced in Ukraine such a corrupt system of government that leaders change, parties change, but this position, the foreign policy position, he called it anti-Russia, continues. And that was, and specifically without naming Zelensky, he talks about Zelensky. So the realization comes that actually you can support or you can go after Poroshenko, count on Zelensky, but the result would be the same because Ukraine is a democracy. Because whoever is the president is actually his job security or her job security depends on the support or not support of the people. And that's basically a very, very bad message to the way how the policy has been conducted by Russia in the post-Soviet space. You can bribe Yanukovych, you can make all sorts of deals with the corrupt elite, but what good does it make when the next day you have a Maidan and Yanukovych leaves the country? So the military, the full-blown war becomes actually a continuation of the policies that start in 2014. So that's another frame that I provide. And now to the ideas. What ideas, what ideologies are being used in this war? One thing that is very clear, that despite the fact that Putin is quite ideological, despite the fact that he believes in certain things. And his idea, his mantra that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, he repeats it again and again. The essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians starts with basically reaffirming that position. But he is not, he is also can be quite flexible in terms of the repertoire of imperial or post-imperial intellectual traditions that he or his speechwriters or ghostwriters refer to. The first one is, of course, the Eurasianism and the idea of Eurasian Union, and that there is a clear connection between the Eurasian ideas of the Russian immigration of the 1920s and 1930s and the neo-Eurasianism of Dugin. I think that direct influence of Dugin on Putin's administration is overstated, but there is no question that the rhetoric associated with Eurasianist ideas, the Russia as a separate civilization, as multi-ethnic civilization, and so on and so forth. There is just nowhere else that you can look for the sources of these ideas but traditional Eurasianism, and then transformation of that Eurasianism in post-1991 Russia. But once the idea of building Eurasian Union doesn't work, Putin can be quite flexible ideologically. The model that comes really from Russian imperial thinking and was translated for Putin by Alexander Solzhenitsyn is the idea of Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. So Solzhenitsyn is a Russian nationalist who imagined Russia as unity of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. That's what is there in his how we should restructure Russia from 1990. That if that doesn't work, there is one more model and one more idea that was fully demonstrated in Crimea, the model of Greater Russia. So we are bringing within the borders of Russia. If any other option doesn't work, we bring ethnic Russians or Russian speakers. And then extension of that now with this bizarre annexation of southern and eastern Ukraine, the territories that Russia didn't even control militarily and keeps actually losing more and more of those territories. That's the extension also of Solzhenitsyn's ideas. You look at his writings on Ruski Vopros, the Russian question from the late 1990s, that's what he says. He names Melitopol, he names Crimea, he names Donbass. So intellectually, the fingerprints of Alexander Solzhenitsyn are all over the bloody book of this war. So intellectually, he is really the father of many ideas that are being really exploited in this war. Now, the final conclusion, the final concluding section that I promised to talk about. This is the global importance of the war and impact on the global order. Today, students in my class alerted me to the news coming from Nagorno-Karabakh. And I don't know, for those of you who didn't have time to follow news, Azerbaijan declared the not special military operation, but the anti-terrorist operation on the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. And the context in which this is happening is really worsening for some time now relations between Russia and Armenia, where Russia served as traditionally protector of Armenia historically, but also in more recent context. And the situation in which Russia, with now the war in Ukraine and being committed to all its troops to Donbass, to southern Ukraine, really is not in a position to provide assistance and help to its client. When Turkey provided and keeps providing support for Azerbaijan, and Turkey becomes more and more important player on the in the post-Soviet space, the back yard of Russia for a long period of time. You look at Kazakhstan and the rhetoric that comes from Kazakhstan, and think about China and building up relations with China. What we see is that the context for all these changes and developments are in this war and dramatic weakening in Russia, in the post-Soviet space, to say nothing about any other parts of the world. So weakening in Russia is one of the key already markers of this war, and we see that again, all sorts of evidence coming from different parts of Eurasia. Finland and Sweden joining NATO, right? If Putin attacked Ukraine because he was so afraid of NATO, I guess the smart move now would be to call off all Russian troops from Ukraine and send to protect the border with NATO that actually is now twice as long as it was before the start of the war. But this is not happening. This is not happening because NATO was a pretext. NATO was a way of providing legitimacy for its actions, if not in the eyes of the West, then certainly in the eyes of global South, or whatever is the right term to call the majority, I guess, of the nations in the world. What you see is the return, what I call the return of the West. This is the title of one of the chapters in the book. We see strengthening NATO, the transatlantic alliance, to a degree that it was really impossible to imagine even a few years before the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War. You see also, if you draw a comparison with the Cold War, you see that this alliance territorially and economically is potentially more powerful than the one that existed before. The proportion of American economic and military, economic force mostly, not military, economic force is less. But you also get quite well doing economically parts of former Eastern Europe, Poland in particular, that are contributing to that effort, to NATO effort. You see the awakening of Germany and really rethinking, reconfiguring what Germans' role should be, who Germans are, and what their relationship should be to the post World War II legacy. And you see also the signs of something that us historians remind about 1950s, and this is on the other side of the world. This is the Sino-Soviet alliance of 1950s. The alliance is not formal yet, but it's also called the most formal of all informal alliances. And in difference to World War II, of course, the roles are changed, where it's China that is now in the driving seat, where China is now a more mature and more responsible international player, and Russia takes the role of China as being poorer economically country and also being more adventurous on the international arena. So really the story of the 1950s. As Mark Twain said, history rhymes itself. History doesn't repeat itself. So there is a trap of paying too much attention to the Cold War, to the parallels that we can draw with that period. But it's also, and again, it's worth examining those parallels and learning from them. But there is also, it's also a different world. And there are also different challenges that come to this world. In the book, I call this war to be a 19th century war in terms of the ideology, the 20th century war in terms of tactics, and 21st century war in terms of military and technology. Well, this is the war of drones, with tens of thousands of drones needed actually almost on the weekly basis. This is the war in which cyber warfare plays extremely important role, or rather it doesn't play as important role as some people suspected, because the counter cyber war measures was so effective on the part of Ukraine, supported by the Western expertise. It's also the war in which we acquire a new understanding of what nuclear threat can be. If during the Cold War, the nuclear threat was about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, today's nuclear threat is primarily, despite the fact that there is, of course, references to the open or not open references to the possibility of using nuclear weapons. But in my opinion, the most likely scenario of this war going nuclear in terms of the radiation becoming part of that story is the story of Zaporizhzhia. So the war for the first time in history came to the nuclear websites. There are websites, I wish websites, to the nuclear sites. And there are 440 of them. And no one whom I ever met even suggested that that maybe is the last war in the world. So there will be other wars, and this is another challenge that we face today. So I will stop here. I'm sure that I already spent more time that I was allowed to, and I will be more than happy now to go maybe deeper into the book and then answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Please have a seat. We'll pass back and forth. Thank you very much for an outstanding sort of summary of what the book is. Who, having just finished it today, it's an incredibly accessible and well-told story of how we got to, frankly, where we are now. The first question is a simple one, which is, you're obviously extremely familiar with the history of Ukraine. This is far from the first book you've written about the history of Ukraine. Is there anything that surprised you when you started writing? Like, is there anything you know now that you didn't think that you really think you actually learned in the process of writing this book that you didn't necessarily know when you started out?
Thanks. Yes, I discovered a lot mostly about post-1991 period, something that, again, was not part of the turfs for historians to go into and to explore. History ended in 91, right? Or maybe in 1989. So the historians were going into history. And so the realization came when I was looking at the 1990s that the history didn't come to an end also in that sense. And I was really surprised to what degree the Ukrainian political elites in the 1990s were trying to follow the example of Yeltsin, really mimicking what was happening in Moscow, and how they eventually realized what was said in the title of President Kuchma's book, "Ukraine is not Russia." And that was the realization that came as a result of numerous sleepless nights and attempts to do what Yeltsin was doing, including the one of the biggest political crises and tragedies and scandals of that era. That's the assassination of one of the Ukrainian journalists, Georgy Gongadze. And I discovered for myself something that I didn't know. I was following the events. I realized the context in which that happened. And the context was that Kuchma was doing exactly what Yeltsin did a few years earlier. He basically introduced the referendum on strengthening the presidential power. And when Yeltsin got away with that entire story, what was happened in Ukraine was the mobilization of opposition against Kuchma. And the killing was to a degree part of that story, but also even more important was that the killing became public, and who became it, basically made it public, was the leader of the opposition in the parliament at that time. So it was a clash between the presidential authority and the parliament of the sort that was happening in Russia. But whatever killings were happening or not happening in Russia never became public because the parliament was not strong enough. The parliament was shut at in 1993. It was already too late. So that sort of things again. My major maybe discoveries were in. It seems to me it's chapter 2, on where I did this comparison of Ukraine and Russia in the 1990s, and really was surprised to what degree the things were interrelated and how differently it turned out.
That's actually a great point, because I would say two things on this. First, the thing that struck me about those chapters was not just about Ukraine's history, but your point, which I think is not commonly thought of in the West, that Russia, frankly, never really had a chance at democracy. That the common narrative that we hear today is, well, Russia was a democracy when Yeltsin was president, then things changed under Putin. And I think one of the things your history demonstrates is from the get-go, Russia's chances at democracy were not great. Essentially the original Congress of People's Deputies essentially allows Yeltsin to rule by decree for a year. The moment they try to take back that power, Yeltsin doesn't like it and eventually shells the parliament building. And the idea that Russia had any kind of sort of, electoral democracy is sort of destroyed in that sense. I do want to ask you about, in some ways, you brought up Kuchma and also, Viktor Yanukovych. Having lived in Ukraine in the 90s and also, sort of watching it, the thing that's striking about Ukraine's political history is that on the one hand, as bad as Russia was economically during this period, Ukraine was even worse. It was a genuine basket case for the first 15 to 18 years of its existence. And it had some truly corrupt leaders, particularly in the form of Yanukovych. But what is striking to me is that they don't, in the end, they cannot pull the trigger, literally, of going as far as Putin does in terms of being able to crack down dissent. You suggest in part that this is due to the fact that Ukraine was sort of much more regionally heterogeneous. I mean, do you think that's the only thing going on, or is it that Ukraine kept looking to the West as its model as opposed to Russia? I mean, that was one of the things that I kept thinking about reading this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, regarding Russian democracy, maybe to make it really, really provocative, but there is some truth in what I'm going to say. It looks like Russian democracy ended with the end of the Soviet Union. Again, it may be exaggeration, but I think it's an important part of the story, because as you say, Yeltsin already starts ruling by decree, and that starts in January of 1991. 92. Another thing that maybe I didn't read carefully the writings of my colleagues in political sciences, but I came to realization that the Russian state was born not only out of this shelling of the parliament, which is the founding act of the modern Russian state, but Russian state was very much born out of the warfare, because the Chechnya already is there in November of 1991, and then 93. And basically, the task for Yeltsin, for any successor of Yeltsin, is to be liked by the public, to be elected, and then to find the way to deal something with Chechnya. So that's why also one of the reasons why you have one Silovik after another, the people coming from the security services or military or replacing as candidates for prime ministers. We're not economists, right? Gaidar is gone. It's the time. So in terms of Ukraine, and that there is regionalism. There is the idea that no one region is strong enough, and it comes also from history. It comes with sometimes different languages, different political traditions, and so on and so forth. And no regional elite is strong enough to fully capture the state. I steal this idea from looking away, so it's not mine. Where I maybe can provide some basically insight as a historian is in the fact looking at the history of Ukrainian national movement and Ukrainian statehood. It's a little bit like the creation of the United States, that in the US here, the people who end up here, they so much distrust the state. They create institutions how to control the state. In Ukraine, there is a distrust of state coming from the history of the existing under numerous empires and rule and control coming from outside of the country. And so you have to find the way how to fool the state. You have to find the way how to sabotage the state. That's how you survive. The Ukrainian national project comes, unlike Russian, that comes within the state and partially with the support of the state. Ukrainian national project comes against the state. And that's why it was so difficult and continues to be difficult even to today to really for Ukrainians to learn to live in their own state. Zelensky was elected 73% support for him personally, but trust in his office was already in the negative within the first months, right? That's institution of the state. Now it is changing during the war. The armed forces, which is certainly the arm of the state, it's not the partisan unit, is the most trusted institution. So the war changes things, but basically, so the point is where I can add to the regionalism is the story of the basically lack of statehood and long story of opposition to the state.
Okay, that leads to two natural follow-on questions. The first is that let's be optimistic. Let's say Ukraine wins this war to some extent, that it ends with essentially Russia withdrawing at a minimum from all the territory that it's gained in 2022, maybe even some of the 2014 territory. So the question would be, what are the implications for Russia, and then what are the implications for Ukraine? So Zbigniew Brzezinski very famously said about Russia that Russia with Ukraine is an empire and Russia without Ukraine is a country. I guess my question is that if Russia loses this war, could we actually see Russia as a country, as opposed to sort of dealing with the post-imperial legacy that you're talking about? And I guess on the flip side, my question is, what does Ukraine look like then? Because as you say, you know, there was strong distrust of Ukraine, or there was strong Ukrainian distrust of the state, and that regional heterogeneity enabled that. But one of the remarkable things about this war, particularly the post-2022 phase, has been the way it really has created, you know, a strong, I guess, conviction in the Ukrainian state. Are you worried about, let's say, Zelensky holding on to power for an indefinite? Are you worried that a Zelensky who wins this war suddenly might be able to do things that, let's say, a Kuchma or a Yanukovych could not?
Yep. Thank you. Let's start with Russia. And you started with the optimistic scenario of Ukraine winning the war, so I will propose the most optimistic scenario about Russia. First of all, you formulated that for me is, I now think that really Russian democracy didn't have much of a chance. And I basically, that belief comes from me suddenly appreciating the importance of history. The nation that didn't exist that doesn't have tradition of any sort of democratic development can't become democratic overnight. So that's something that no one really wanted to, including myself, didn't want to see or to recognize back in 1990 and 91. And I think that actually now, 30 plus years later, we can't afford not to see that and not to recognize that. So democracy in Russia can be marginally more democratic, yes, but democracy after somehow Ukraine's victory, collapse of the regime, I don't see it happening. Yeah, they can be flirting for a year or two, but long term, I don't see it happening over time. It's not that I don't believe in Russia changing and changing in the democratic transformation. I don't believe in this happening as a miracle and happening overnight. Now, if it's not democracy and liberal democracy, what is Russia's future? Well, the most powerful force, my understanding today, ideological force in Russia is nationalism. And if you look at the number of people also recently at least killed or imprisoned, it is about nationalism as well. That's where the regime sees also the biggest threat coming from, not even from the liberals, yes, in the association with the West, but mostly nationalism. So my best case scenario is that this nationalism after the victory of Ukraine turns into a modern type of nationalism where it will become already clear, also thanks to the hundreds of thousands of coffins coming from Ukraine, that Russia has to start thinking about itself as Russia and not as Solzhenitsyn's how we should restructure Russia model. So that's one positive outcome for Russia that I can see coming from this war. And another one is that especially now with the shift toward China, cutting ties with Europe and so on and so forth, I see the long established Russian tradition of orientation toward Europe eventually rebelling. And
sorry, did you say rebelling or rebounding?
Rebounding, but rebelling against the current status.
Okay, right.
So because still it's difficult for me to imagine a member of the Russian elite flying to Beijing to spend the weekend instead of going to Paris. It can happen, it can change, but I don't see it happening within the next generation or two. I don't see the member of the Russian elite surely putting stolen money into the Beijing banks. It can happen, but I don't see that happening in the next generation. So that's where history matters, and I think that the best case scenario for Russia is basically reconfiguring what the nationalism will be and providing a policy that actually more beneficial to Russia, because the policy that current regime conducts, it's not just destroys Ukraine. It's basically very harmful for Russia as well. So that's the best case scenario for Russia. For Ukraine, certain things that were on Ukraine's wish list are now becoming closer and closer to reality. So integration into the European Union, integration into NATO. Again, things can change, but at this point, the trajectory is very clear. One thing that this war produced already and will produce is the disappearance of the gray zones. Finland is on the one side of the fence already. It's not basically sitting on the fence. Ukraine, after the end of the war, whatever is the outcome of the war and whatever Ukraine territory at that point is, can't be gray zone anymore. So that integration in the Western structures, which are open for democratic states alone. They can be imperfect democracy and so on and so forth. So that trend already works for Ukrainian democracy. The fears about the more authoritarian rule emerging in Ukraine are real and realistic. We yesterday had at the Ukrainian Institute one of the key public intellectuals today in Ukraine, Yevhen Hlibovitsky, who said, I rephrase it, he had a longer argument, but basically the way how I understood it was, okay, if you want to save Ukrainian democracy, provide weapons and provide them now. Because providing them over a longer period of time can maybe still save Ukraine, but actually can put democracy in danger. Because the longer war goes on, especially in the young democracy like Ukraine, the stronger are reasons, and very good reasons, for centralization of power and all power and so on and so forth. And with the president like Volodymyr Zelensky, who is quite impressive on all fronts, and he certainly under these conditions is very much interested in strengthening the presidential power. We don't know We don't know how it will turn. Again, I'm optimistic because of the European integration. I also optimistic because of the Ukrainian history. It's if some form of more authoritarian regime emerges, that would be a break with really decades and centuries of Ukrainian history, and that's certainly not what people on the front lines want today. And they will come back, and they will have their own ideas about corruption, about democracy, about the state. So I'm more optimistic than pessimistic in that regard.
All right, I have one last question, then I'm going to go to the audience, which is I am curious what you have to say about China in this book, because you sort of give two messages on this. The first is that while China supported Russia, and there was obviously the sort of friendship without limits declaration prior to the war, that the fact that the war was not over in a week was awful for China's interests. That it might have tolerated a quick, sort of war, but as the war has dragged on, it suffered economically. It certainly suffered in terms of its prestige, because it's caught in the awkward situation of supporting a country that was clearly sort of violating the Westphalian order. But that said, you also say in the afterword that you think that China is also the country that is best positioned to exploit Russia's split with the West. So to go back to what you said about, whether you think Russia will rebound back to the West, do you think China will be able to essentially ensnare Russia, to the point where Russia really, even if it does want to pivot back to the West? And by the way, Chris Miller's book on Russia's constant pivoting to the East always shows that this never works out very well, and it always eventually goes back. But could this time around China be powerful enough to keep Russia in its orbit?
Well, the short answer is I don't know.
It was unfair. I asked a question about the future, and you don't do that with this.
Yes, with Russia is in historically new position now, because, and here I'm still in ideas from David Wolf, professor at Hokkaido University in Japan, who in his recent paper basically looked at this shifts in the Russian policy from the West to the East and back. And the argument there is that once Russia suffers sort of a defeat or setback in the West, it goes east and kind of compensates for that. And now it looks like the same sort of a situation, except that China is not weak anymore. The area to expand territorially, economically, militarily is now blocked. And how it will turn out, again, history in that sense has its limitations. At least history is there to recognize that there is a new phenomenon, there is a new development. I don't believe in the long-term Russian-Chinese friendship. Partially also looking at the 1950s, and 1950s is the friendship without limits, and 1960s is the threat of the nuclear war, not between the USSR and the United States, but between USSR and China. I don't see it happening so fast, but there is a lot of historical, cultural, and other things that work long-term against that alliance of unequals. But in the short to medium terms, I think that alliance has very good chances to be strengthened. China, again, will be the primary beneficiary out of that. Again, China, I have no doubt that China is preferred that war would not happen. So I take them at their word. But once it happened, again, they're positioning themselves to benefit from it, and they certainly in a good position now. We are also in a situation where we can wake up to the news of another Prigozhin coup, and the war is not going well for Russia. Wars going not well for Russia traditionally bring change of government, change of regime, starting from the or at least some form of reforms, starting from Crimean War, going into Russo-Japanese to World War One, and even not really, but even about Afghan war, some sort of an argument can be made. So things can change, but I also don't see, and I write about that book, I don't see things returning to pre-February 2022 situation in terms of Russia's relations to Europe, not only for political reasons, but also that there's divesting from Russian oil and gas. It's also about climate change. It's about now not repeating the mistake of Germany. It's about Germany and Japan waking up to the realization that they have to care about their own security issues. So a lot of things that change, that the change of regime in Russia will not undo those. Thank you.
Okay, why don't you hold on to the mic, but I will call on people who want to ask questions. Do we have another mic? Or
No, but you all can speak up.
okay, just my only request is that if I call on you, please identify yourself. So Professor Plokhy can.
So that I can see it.
Yeah, that sounds okay. Sure, but I can see everyone. So questions. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Adam, student in the Master of Transatlantic Affairs. Thank you for the presentation. Actually, a question regarding Georgia and the implication of the war in Ukraine towards the occupation of Georgia by Russia. I wanted to try to have your opinion on, do you think it's even an eventuality that Georgia is capable of pushing back, especially would now be the moment for the Georgian government? Or if the situation won't change on the territory. Just a quick second question regarding, you spoke about the rise of nationalism in Russia, Russia seeing itself maybe as a country and being seen as a country if they lose the war in Ukraine. How would that play on an eventual discussion that often comes out on the independence of certain regions in Russia? Would the defeat in Ukraine would bring to the disintegration of the Russian state itself? Yes or no, and to what extent? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Excellent questions. So on Georgia issue, I will provide two answers to things that I think I know, understand, and I will not talk about probably the most important factor in all of that, the politics and dynamics in Georgia itself. So I don't know really what is happening. I sort of know, but I don't fully understand what is happening in Georgia in terms of the potential for the future. But in terms of the current geopolitical context and what is happening in Armenia, what is happening in Kazakhstan, clearly this is the time, this is the moment. Russian grip on the post-Soviet space is significantly weakened. So that's the factor that works in favor of Georgia. Georgia basically escaping what is today's Russia's sphere of influence. And then historically, Georgia already was trying to do that more than once. The Soviet Union was created by Lenin in opposition to Stalin to accommodate two troublemakers, the Georgian and the Ukrainian communists. So the problems with Georgia and Ukraine, these problems that Russia has been experiencing at least for 100 years. So that historical trajectory also says that there is this possibility, but again, the key factor is something that I can't comment in what is happening in Georgia itself. But historically and geopolitically, that there are powerful forces at work pushing Georgia in that direction. Now, with regard to the Russian Federation and its future, I will go back to this my belief that the most powerful force ideologically, intellectually in today's Russian politics is Russian nationalism. And what that means is that even if it is redefined the way how is suggested, leaving the three-partite model of Russian nation of imperial times behind and focusing on Russia, or what Lenin called Great Russia and Great Russians themselves, that would serve as a glue that would keep St. Petersburg and Vladivostok together. Anything can happen, but I think the chances of that happening are extremely high. But also the strength of Russian nationalism, this is something that will push away the non-Russian regions. Again, the news today arrived from Nagorno-Karabakh, but also from Chechnya, or from rather Moscow and the hospital in Moscow. What is happening with the current leader of Chechnya? Chechnya is de facto already a state within a state. So any change of the regime, any significant shock, political shock in Russia itself, Chechnya is ready to go. And we also see that the war and this unfair taxation in blood for the recruitment into the Russian army among the non-Russian nationalities, that produces all sorts of pushback, or at least produced pushback for a while in North Caucasus, even in Yakutia, and so on and so forth. So these things can acquire much more power and dynamic. So my projection for the future of Russia, if there is change of borders, and Russians actually opened that Pandora box by annexing the territories that they don't even control. So Russia is not controlling today its constitutional territory. So formally, the disintegration of the Russian Empire is already happening today now as the result of this war. So, and if that happens, if that continues, I don't see Russia going the way of China with warlords or the Revolutionary War. But I certainly see that there will be growing tensions between the Russians and non-Russians within the Russian Federation that can contribute to the change of the borders.
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for this presentation. My name is Pau. I'm also a math student. My question was drawing back from historical lessons. What is your opinion on Ukraine's future Marshall Plan, and what role should the transatlantic partnership play in helping Ukraine recover itself from the war? For example, should we expect more commitments from the G7, or should we just stick to the transatlantic governance we have seen since the war, or should the US lead this Marshall Plan? What are the historical lessons we can draw from?
Sure. Well, one thing is that the talk about the Marshall Plan started relatively early, already in the spring, when even the scope of the war and destruction was not fully clear. It's not over yet, so it's not yet clear, but it's humongous. So clearly, the parallels and the need for something like Marshall Plan becomes more important. The Marshall Plan, as you know, came with strings attached. No communists in the French government, no communists in the Italian government, and other things. The Marshall Plan of the new certainly is not about communism, right? But there absolutely have to be strings attached dealing with the issues of democracy. Again, Ukraine so far is doing fine, but we don't know when the war will end, and also the issues of corruption. And everyone to whom I talk to understands that and knows that. Now, what is actually different this time around, and again, history rhymes but doesn't repeat itself, is that this is an opportunity for Europe to pay back. So it's US is very much in the leading position today when it comes. There is no parallels in terms of the military equipment, but EU already financially contributes more to war effort than the United States of America, right? And I think that this new reality has to be also the new model for the Marshall Plan. if only because the US of 2023 economically doesn't have the same share of the GDP as the US of 1950 had, or 1949. So I think there is certainly a need for that. There have to be strings attached like it was with the Marshall Plan, and it has to be a transatlantic effort rather than US effort or just European effort.
Thank you, Professor. My name's John Bennett. I'm a old student at the Fletcher School. My question's three parts, so I'll try and keep them fairly brief. Do you believe that ground forces, more weapons for Ukraine, do you think ground forces such as additional Leopard tanks would be sufficient? Or do you mean F-15 fighter planes from America? Second question, do you think that Russia would be able to hold on to Chechnya and keep them in their orbit post-Kadyrov? He's allegedly possibly already dead as we speak. And third, do you think that the example that Russia's set in their catastrophic failure in Ukraine has reduced the likelihood of Chinese territorial aggression in Taiwan?
On Taiwan, yes, I think that it has an impact. So it shows that the special military operations can backfire. And that happened with Ukraine, where no one knew that Ukraine had an army, right? And we all know Taiwan and they're preparing for the war for a long period of time. There were very clear statements from the White House before the Russo-Ukrainian War. Mr. Putin, please don't worry. Whatever you do, US will not be involved militarily. Yeah, that was the message from the White House. The message on Taiwan is different. We will get involved, right? So that's also a warning sign. So I think that not the war in Ukraine, the Ukrainian resistance. Let's put it that way. The Ukrainian resistance made the possibility of the attack on Taiwan happening anytime soon much less likely than it was before. So that was Taiwan. The second was Chechnya. Yeah, the analysis that I heard today while driving in my car, which I think is a very reasonable one, that a lot under the circumstances will depend on basically the Chechen clans and political structure. If they agree on the successor, probably there will be no major shifts and major changes. If they start actually competing for the position of the Kadyrov, there can be all sorts of things which will have ripple effect, including leading eventually to independence of Chechnya sooner rather than later. And it looks like at this point, Putin is not powerful enough to just appoint a successor on his own without backing of the regional clans. So not my analysis, something that I heard. I thought it was reasonable. And then on the type of weapons that US supplies or doesn't supply, I'm not a military expert. I have no real understanding of what the tank does with the sort of the minefields that exist today. Maybe very few people know about that because that's unprecedented. I understand that the density is unprecedented, but nobody knows. As not a military expert, I am puzzled to basically hear on TV from military experts, first heightened expectations and then disappointment about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Because people whom I listen, they represent US Army or they represent NATO Army. From what I know, under no circumstances the US or NATO Army was starting any offensive, counteroffensive, or whatever action of that sort without full control of the skies, without superiority with the tanks and other things. And again, I'm very appreciative of everything that U.S. Army in particular does to arm and to train the Ukrainian army. But the sort of questions that I ask to myself, really, I wonder how good advice those people can provide. They never fought the wars with that sort of the army as equipped as the Russian army. They never fought any war without complete air superiority, and they never fought a war in which they would be outgunned. So that's the questions that I have. If there are military experts in the audience and can explain to me, I would appreciate that, but I'm still looking for the answers. So my reading of that is that it's basically a lot of misjudgment. First, misjudging the potential of the Russian and Ukrainian armies in February of 2022. And now just pendulum went into different directions. No one expected Ukrainians to fight. And then by default, the expectation is that Ukrainians can perform miracles even without barehanded, without F-16, without tanks, and so on and so forth. So at least that's the expertise that we get from TV. I hope certainly that it's a different sort of expertise that is happening on the level of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and communications with the Ukrainian counterparts. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm Artem. I'm here with some Ukrainian students, and thank you so much for being here. It's amazing. So I have a really quick question. So knowing the history of some countries who were under war, there have been anti-war movements that actually were successful. And I'll mention authoritarian Serbia and sort of democratic America during the Vietnam War. So there were different preconditions for those revolutions or movements. And maybe we are not seeing those in Russia, but maybe there is something that could be artificially induced inside Russia, whether we're talking about liberals or nationalists or anarcho-communists, whoever the popular they are right now. So, yeah, there's preconditions for that.
Well, you need to have some form of democracy, right?
Not in Serbia back then. Well,
or at least weakened central government, and we don't see this in Russia, right? So we don't know what Russians think, but again, some of the experts whose assessments I believe still think that over 50% of the population is still in favor of the war, or at least they trick themselves into thinking, okay, maybe we don't want the war, but we are already in the war, and the only way out is for us to win, right? So whatever the explanation is. So it's not the type of environment where the minority can demonstrate and get away with that. The last major protests were happening with Navalny, and that was on the issue of corruption. So which is political, of course, but it's not about, okay, we want to replace the government, we want to replace the president or something like that. So I don't see that happening really in the Russia, given that it's basically it either becomes more and more authoritarian or more dictatorial, whatever. I leave that to people in political sciences to argue what exactly it is, but it is not a democracy which allows that sort of mobilization. So no, I don't see that. Again, as a historian, I can imagine the situation like happened in St. Petersburg and then in Petrograd in 1905 and 1917. Bad news coming from the front lines, shortages of food or shortages of some sort of supplies. The military units that are stationed in the capital don't want to go to the front lines, and you have sorts of not a coup, but some sort of a public uprising. rather than Belgrade type of peaceful demonstrations gathering on the weekends and then going back to work and coming back and not being arrested. So it's more like first 1905 and 1917 Russian Revolution scenario, at least for me, is easier to imagine than the situation in Serbia.
Can I actually follow up on this? Because the one other analogy I can think of, and it was something that you don't talk about in the book, but it strikes me as interesting, is whether you could see a parallel to, let's say, East Germany in '89, in the sense that once Putin ordered the mobilization, we've had 1.5 million Russians exit the country to obviously avoid that. If the war worsens within Russia, in other words, if you see more Ukrainian attacks on Russian cities, if Putin has to call for another mobilization, could you see enough of an exodus from Russia that actually prompts some kind of regime change? Much in the same way that, what happened in East Germany is that once East Germans realized they could go through Prague and get to West Germany, something like 1% of the population left in the span of a month.
Yeah. Well, I really don't know what is the situation now with the live in Russia, but my understanding is that it's almost impossible to do what was happening last year. So the exodus is controlled. So the Berlin Wall is not falling. They're not opening the checkpoints. They're not opening the checkpoints. And that's the and also another the nationalism plays out differently in the Berlin Wall story and Russia story, right? For Germans there was another Germany, right? For Russia, just break into Finland, and they're already breaking into Ukraine, of course, but in a different way, in a different form. So yeah, I don't expect that happening, but
yeah.
Hello, Professor. My name is Vincent. I'm a second year student here. I was very interested by the parallel that you built in between today's war and the 19th century from an ideological standpoint. And if we go back, for instance, in the Habsburg Empire, both Serbians, Croatians, Hungarians shared a common national feeling, right? Common features to this national feeling, common myths, a culture, a common literature, a language, and all. Now the Ukrainian newborn national feeling seems a bit different. So I'm curious to know a bit more about, from your perspective, what do you think are the main features of this new national feeling? You've been discussing about the distrust against the state. And a follow-up question would be, do you think that this Ukrainian national feeling could become a new model, a new transnational model, let's say, in the context of this destroyed or empire?
Second, before you answer, there was one other hand I saw, so we'll take this last question and then you get the last one.
One more here.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. Actually, you know what? Answer this and then I'll take the last questions.
yeah, thank you. Indeed, you look at the Spring of Nations in the 19th century. Yeah, that's the model of nationalism, based very much on the idea of ethnicity, language, and culture. So the German models further. That's what is there, and that's to a degree the model that Russian army was trying to bring to Ukraine. The idea is about organizing the loyalty and the Russian nation over the issues of ethnicity, language, and culture. If you speak Russian, you are Russian. Your loyalty has to be to Moscow, and so on and so forth. And it sort of worked in Crimea and to a degree in Donbass in 2014. But it completely failed in 2022, with the population of Russian cities marching under the Ukrainian flags against the Russian tanks. And Ukraine fought back with a different model of national mobilization. So the nation where we have the only president of Jewish background outside of Israel, the newly appointed Minister of Defense is a Crimean Tatar. One of the most prominent military commanders, the savior of Kiev, General Serhii, is an ethnic Russian born in Yaroslav in Volga region. And the war being fought on the Ukrainian side in two languages. Plus the religious landscape in Ukraine is quite fragmented between different groups of Eastern Christians and so on and so forth. So the Ukraine fought back with the model of the political nation, of the sort that you read about in the textbooks, but can't find in reality. So Ukraine is the closest to that model of the political nation that we write about, at least today, at least now. The war also produces actually change in the symbolic and other importance of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture. It is growing dramatically. But at this point, it's basically a bilingual, multi-religious, and to a degree multi-ethnic nation that fights against the model of the nation based on language. So whether that can be a model for the rest of the region, I think it's too late after the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, the moving of the borders of World War I, and then the Yugoslav wars. So it's already the spaces are mono-ethnic and monolinguistic in most of the places. So I don't know whether that's the model that can be embraced somewhere else, but that's the model that allowed Ukraine to survive.
Okay, we've got a minute left, and I saw two hands, which I'm going to call on. So I'm going to ask no multi-part questions, very brief questions. So you in the back.
Very good. Sophia, all the way from New Hampshire, Vermont border. For some of them who may know, unfortunately, cradle for some time of Solzhenitsyn, but that's a different story. So Professor Plokhy, very good lecture. Thank you for educating us a little bit more about the other part of the world, so to speak, where lots of action is happening right now. So thank you for shedding more light on it. The question I have, I think you are very privileged, just as myself, because we do speak Ukrainian language. So we firsthand understand what's happening out there in Ukraine. What advice would you give to people in this room who may not have a privilege like you and I speaking Ukrainian language, to understand more beyond the lectures, beyond the TV, beyond what we receive here, get a little bit more of a glimpse of Ukrainian situation from the eyes of Ukrainians in Ukraine, their feelings, their emotions, their future, their hopes, and everything else politically that is and legally that is happening right now in Ukraine and has been happening for the past year and a half and more as the war was going on.
Okay, and sorry, one last question. Go.
So, Mike Bruce, I'm one of the military fellows here. Question is, we talked a lot about the conventional support that the West has provided. Does the book touch on, and if not, what's your opinion on kind of the influx of foreign fighters supporting the Ukrainian military and kind of the desire of people that are no longer actively serving a lot of the United States, but all Western countries, and their desire to want to use their specialities to help the Ukrainian military?
Thank you. Thank you for both questions. So with regard to the first question, it's very simple. Just learn Ukrainian. and for those of you who are in academia and know Russian or Polish or other Slavic languages, at the Harvard Summer School we are offering Ukrainian for reading knowledge. You will be trained into Ukrainian reader within 8 weeks course. So the language is necessary to understand culture, to understand the something that is beyond the headlines happening with the nation. But other than that, I want to say that the war produced a new phenomenon for Ukraine in terms of reporting. Even before that, the most of the stuff that was coming on the region was coming from the reporters stationed in Moscow. Now you have Luke Harding, you have others, you have really brave people going. David Betsarakis, it seems to me, I'm not butchering his last name, it's a Greek name, who are going out there. Again, another Chris Miller, not your Chris Miller.
Yeah.
It's very confusing. That's
just published a book. So there are good, brave reporters who actually go into Ukraine and write about that and report, and that is a good and excellent source, but that's a temporary solution. The permanent one is enrolling into the Ukrainian Harvard Research Institute summer school, and it's the classes start in late June. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to. Now, with regard to the foreign fighters, so maybe there is a better word for that. This book dedicated to two people in particular who were killed in this war, and one of them is a brother of someone whom I knew quite well, who was fighting in the foreign legion, but basically as a Ukrainian, as an interpreter. I talked to some of my students who are in the U.S. military in special operations, and I was asking, what do you feel? And they said, okay, we just want to be there. The guys whom I trained, they're fighting. I'm here, and it's really touches your heart, and I just want to say thank you, and I'm very glad that Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian armed forces, create conditions that allow that to happen, allow people to come. There are people who get killed, and so that's also importance for the Ukrainian society, where many, and I was in Ukraine in late August, early September. I just came back. There is basically the one of the key questions that everyone asks me coming from the US: why there is no weapons? Why? How long should we wait for that? And when you see people from US, from Britain, from other countries there on the ground, that says a lot. There is also political importance and significance, and this is for Russians and for Belarusians fighting on the Ukrainian side. That's the, again, symbolism, political symbolism is extremely important of those actions as well. So Russia, of course, tries to turn this around and use for its own purposes. And the idea was that, of course, the Ukrainians can't fight in the first months. Those were all either Americans or Poles or the British or the NATO forces already on the ground there. Now you hear less and less of that. So there is some recognition of Ukrainians as basically being a force that can fight and can resist. But the importance of the foreign fighters on the ground who came just because they thought that was a just war to fight is extremely important. So thank you.
So before we all thank Professor Plokhy, just two quick announcements. First, there's a small reception that's happening right outside on the 7th floor. And also, obviously, the Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, is also available for purchase outside. I'm pretty sure that Professor Plokhy will be around to autograph. Yakuyu. Thank you.